Pranay, as I was saying, no formal introduction, nothing. Let's just get started. And this is just a conversation. But I would like to begin with a sentence that stuck with me the first time I read it. And let me quote this. This is from a book that you have co-edited with a couple of other people. It's called India's Marathon: Reshaping the Post-Pandemic World Order. Now, I don't know if you have written this sentence, but I loved it. So I'm going to read it out. And I want to begin from here. The Arthashastra says that policy precedes all action. We humbly add that policy in turn is preceded by an imagination of a desirable future. And the reason I love that sentence is because I can spend an hour talking about the definition of economics. I'm sure you can spend an hour talking about a definition of a public policy, but ultimately the idea is to build a better society. And the dream of a better future or a better society, I don't think is something that you need to be formally trained in. And their education in its most deepest, most meaningful sense really comes into play, where you bring in order to define for yourself what your vision of a better future is, you have to bring in multiple influences: arts, music, culture, conversations, friends, whatever. What have been the influences in your life that have determined for you what your better future should be?
Yeah, okay. Deep question. First of all, but I'm actually petrified to be here because I'm wondering how to make this conversation without feeling like two uncles talking. Given that you already had 40 such conversations, I don't know what I can add to this. So anyways, thanks for organizing this, and I'm so happy that you folks are doing this back to college series. And if there are any things that I could add, and there are around 20-30 people here, so if you have any questions, thoughts, disagreements, please feel free to discuss. I'm here to learn. So Ashish, going back to your question, I think those are my words, and actually what I had in mind while writing that is a lot of our policy thinking or even our common discourse is about finding faults, right? Finding what is wrong. And I think it is really important, right, to do that. But I guess to make change, finally, you need to also be able to connect and tell what a better world would look like, and unless we can connect with that, and people can connect with what is the alternative, how is it that things could improve, critiquing policy or doesn't make sense. Beyond a point of time, there is no signal in it, right? It's just noise. You're just going to say government is wrong. Yeah, who doesn't know that? I don't think the people will disagree that there are many things that can be improved. But what is that desirable future that you finally want? Being able to articulate that and being able to even say it in a way that many people can connect with is really important. So that's sort of the main thought that I had in mind. And when we were writing about post-pandemic world order, again, we tried to think of what is the India that you want in 2035, 2040, right? What are some of the main sort of societal, international relations wise, what is the way you want India to be positioned? Until and unless we imagine that, it's tough, right? Otherwise, we'll just be in the here and the now and always saying things are not right, things are too bad, India can never change and things like that. So cynicism sets in. Then that's why I think it is important to imagine a better future and then see what is the policy that will get you to that new point that you want to do. So that was sort of my thought.
Okay.
I didn't answer your question, by the way, but
yeah. So what would be the answer to the question? What have been the influences in your life that defined for you what a better future should be?
So I think, are you asking personally or is it from a larger policy lens?
Both, to the extent that you're okay speaking about them.
Yeah. So let me talk about the policy sense. I think the main influence is what's written behind me. I don't know if you can see, but it's called Yogakshema. It's what the Arthashastra talks about, right? So the idea is peaceful enjoyment of prosperity, right? Roughly translated. So I think that is like when we think of public policy at Takshashila, otherwise we are thinking about how can we reach Yogakshema, right? How close can we reach that goal? So how can there be more prosperity, more peaceful enjoyment for prosperity for all Indians, right? And that's sort of the goal that connects. Yeah, for me personally, better future always has meant being able to learn more. If I am able to learn one new thing every day, I think like that is what I want to put myself in situations where I'm able to do that. And as long as I'm able to learn one new thing every day, I think I'm going towards that better future for me at a personal level.
There's a reason I wanted to ask this question to start the series on Back to College with you. It's because from that perspective, anybody at any point of time is by definition a student of public policy, right? If what you're doing is envisioning a better world, then it doesn't matter how young or old you are, whether you're professionally qualified or not, all of us in a sense are students of public policy. At the age that these students are at, how can they learn to be better at the art of asking, how can we make the world a better place?
How can, I'm still thinking, do you have any thoughts in mind?
Part of it is what you said, and it's all of us. It's not just people of a particular age. Like you said, it's easy to criticize, but it's difficult to build. But the one thing that you can as a student do is figure out how we can get better at building anything out. And sure, like you and I were speaking before this recording started, it may happen that the making stuff better is started, but we don't see it through.
Yeah.
But that's okay. Learning to build rather than always criticizing all the time is one way. And therefore, at the margin, students should be actually doing rather than learning, or rather learning for the sake of doing. Is one broad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree. And just the fact that even like there are many times when you sort of don't like a thing that you're doing, and you always the other side seems better, right? So yeah, the subject that I'm doing is not good, so let me jump to other things, and that sort of also helps you diversify. But I think one idea to keep in mind is, if you've taken up something, can you be marginally better in the next day in what you're doing itself, right? Like it does not necessarily mean a better future means all of us join a non-profit organization, right? Or all of us learn economics, or all of us are joining the army and fighting on the borders, like some people will say. That's not the idea of a better future, right? So because like Yogakshema means you would need peaceful enjoyment of prosperity. It means everything, right? It means better security, better economics, better connecting with other people, better humanities, etc. So for all of those, the idea I would start is just being better at what you're doing currently, starting there, being marginally better every day. That itself is, I think, really important. I think I'll just quote, I think in one of our postgraduate programs, someone asked something similar, like what can I do to change India? There is like so many things to be done. The challenge seems daunting. And I think the question was asked to Pratap Bhanu Mehta. He was taking one class and he said the same thing, like, can you do the thing that you're doing better? In the field that you're working on. As long as you're doing that, you're contributing to India being a better place. So I think that connected with me. That's a good way to think of it. Otherwise, every challenge seems daunting. In the wrong place, probably you need to do something else. And once you reach that place, you will feel you need to do something else, right? So idea is, what can you do things better that you are already in, might be a nice way to start off.
Okay. One recurring theme in this talk is always what advice you would want to give to somebody knowing what you do now. And when I say somebody, I mean somebody in an undergrad course. Would this be an advice that you would have wanted to give to Pranay from engineering, or was Pranay from engineering already focused on becoming a little bit better every day?
No, I would have definitely given this advice to myself at that time as well. Yeah, this is all uncle talk, right? So yeah, I would definitely have given this advice back then. But yeah, I think there are many more things that I would have told myself back then. One thing is just like what you do regularly, right? And I'm sure you must be telling this to all the people at Gokhale Institute as well. Just writing to learn, right? You don't learn by reading. You learn by writing, and actually, you learn even better by teaching smart people. That's the best way to sort of learn. So I think one thing I would have sort of told myself if I could is just to teach someone, like it doesn't need to be in a class, but just I did it very informally, like teaching some people a concept when that used to be my revision, right? But just if you are able to do that to 5-6 people at once, and then people will ask you questions that you hadn't thought of, that I think is the most powerful way of learning. So one thing I've learned is sort of, this Philip Tetlock had this idea, right? Outcome irrelevant learning in super forecasting. So I have a flip side to it, right? Outcome oriented learning. How do you think of outcome oriented learning? And outcome oriented learning for me is, for example, many times people will say take different courses, learn new things. But that is not the way I feel, because if you think of taking a new course, it again becomes a task on your head. It just becomes another course like at your college, right? So flip that around and say that you want to get an outcome out of it, right? So let's say you want to write an op-ed on the on a discipline that you know nothing about, right? So let's say I want to write about, for me, if I were in engineering and I know nothing about economics, so if I would have thought, let me think of writing about what is India's most primary economic challenge, just ideating on that. And my goal would have been that maybe in 1 month I should be able to write this down, say a 2,000-word essay. Once I think of that as an outcome, then I'll be able to and take Coursera, go to some other places, read efficiently to the point that you have to get to that goal, right? And that I think is more important. Otherwise, there is no shortage of information now, right? And we get lost in courses and content, and then we don't. After reading so many things, we'll still feel inept to do a particular thing. So if you put that goal up front, I want to write something, can just be a small article, or I want to teach someone, and then backtrack from there. I think that sort of is something I would have told myself back then, and I try to do that now, but it would have helped back then, right?
This is a nice way to segue into a question that I wanted to ask, especially you. You have, as we've spoken about, an engineering background, and then you got into the field of public policy. Was that a help or was it a hindrance? Whatever it is that you picked up in terms of meta skills while being an engineering student, when you started to learn public policy, I'm not asking about the vocation or your inclination for the subject, but the meta skills that you picked up, did they help? And therefore, is there an argument to be made about learning different things across your life?
Yeah, so I think it was both ways. It runs both ways. Let me go with the positive side first. And the biggest benefit of the engineering discipline was this idea of having a solution mindset, right? So the idea is that you need to move ahead. You need to think of, one, how can you make things better than they are currently, and two, perfect is the enemy of the good, right? So idea is, in engineering there is no perfect. You're still thinking of what is it that you can marginally improve at each point of time. And both those are really important ideas for public policy as well, right? Now, why I say that is because there's a difference between being in a think tank and being in academic setting, right? In academia, you're thinking of a perfectly designed experiment. You're thinking about a paper. You're probably taking 6 months, one year for an article, and that is a chiseled form of an article, which is an epitome of perfection, right? But that is not what real public policy is, right? So we've had so many situations. Government will come and tell, see, tomorrow I want a solution for the problem that I should have solved yesterday. Can you give me an input? Now, I can't go at to that person and then say, see, I don't have enough data, I will come back to you in 6 months. That's not possible, right? So you have to move ahead and you have to think of solutions, right? The solutions will not be perfect. The solutions will not solve all the challenges that you want. So, and you have to encounter trade-offs. I think engineering teaches you that trade-offs are what you have to confront at every step. And still, so you won't design a perfect public policy, but can you make the public policy better off than what the status quo is? That with that goal, I think engineering mindset helps you to move ahead. So many times I see people are good at formulating problems, so they will know the history, geography of all problems, right? Like they'll be really good at it. But public policy, if you're in a think tank or if the government is asking you, there's no value in trying to address the problem in various ways, right? The people in the government know the problem much better than we do. That's why they are in the government. They would have seen the on-ground situation, etc. But if they are coming to you, they are looking for what's the way ahead. Like, don't tell me the history, geography of this. Tell me what is the solution. So that, I think, engineering mindset helps, right? So you're able to go ahead and don't think of reformulating or restating the problem. Think of what can be done now that the problem exists. The flip side to that is, of course, engineering mindset can also mean that you can solve everything, right? That can be, and everything. That you might think of the society as a system, as a black box, where if you give some inputs, what the outputs are, which obviously it is not, right? So I think what the thing that I had to relearn after sort of going away from engineering is just to appreciate many other disciplines, right? So after engineering, I was trying for UPSC for some time. So I learned sociology. It was a subject I loved. So that sort of gave me an exposure into, this is also so interesting, right? Like you're able to understand society in a way that, and you're able to ask new questions. Forget about answers, right? Ask questions that you hadn't even thought of before. So that sort of led me to think of sociology and then other subjects. So that is the pitfall of an engineering mindset. But so it really helped for me to understand economic reasoning, sociology, and still so many other subjects to learn. But thinking of a problem from various logics and various disciplines is something that is helpful, and an engineering mindset can come in the way of that. So that's what I would say.
If you're saying that engineering taught you how to treat society as a black box, so you do X and then Y will happen, I thought that was our copyright. That's what economists do for a living.
Yeah, there are. I think economists and engineers have many things in common that they'll hate to admit, but there are.
So as it turns out, leaving engineering was pointless in the long run. Okay, this is again related to engineering. If 20 or maybe 25 years ago, I think if you're told a geopolitical analyst that they would need to know what fabless means, what the importance of 5mm, 7mm, 9mm is, they probably wouldn't have believed you, and vice versa. If you had told somebody who knew the semiconductor industry that one day your industry is going to be at the forefront of geopolitics, it's something that would have seemed unbelievable. You seem to be the kind of person who has that lucky, I mean, it's up to you to tell me whether it is lucky or not, but you have the ability to move seamlessly across both worlds. And given what is happening in Taiwan right now, that's a huge advantage. For the benefit of the students, would you mind elaborating a little bit on what I just said?
Yeah, so yeah, really, I mean, you're absolutely right. When I was in that field, the big grouse we used to have, no one ever talks about semiconductors. We used to always think, I mean, outside that world, people used to talk about Facebook and Google, and the software was what was called the tech, at the forefront of anything tech. No one bothered about what chip is inside, what's driving. And 5-6 years down the line, we are here where everyone's talking about semiconductors. People who are forced to know that because of the automotive shortage and all that, right? So yeah. I think that you're absolutely right. And that time you used to think, everyone says only Intel talks about when you talk about Intel Inside is a sticker which is put on your laptops, right? No, why doesn't anyone say Texas Instruments inside or Qualcomm inside and things like that? You know, that was the feeling we used to have back then. But yeah, so the reason why it's sort of become important is precisely because it's a very interesting supply chain, and I think this a lot of advancements that have happened in semiconductors are because of the economics of that supply chain, right? It is so diversified, and it is sort of comparative advantages pinnacle, you know. So there the supply chain is really complex. So what happened after 1980s, until 1980s, the main game was in memories, you know. So if you could build better memories, you were in the game. And in fact, there were a lot of industrial policy done by the US to stop memory companies from going to Japan, and that failed, you know, like all industrial policies often fail. But then the game just changed. The game changed to logic, and the game changed to idea of building better processors, and that's where Intel sort of took off, and the rest we know. So what happened after that is a really interesting thing. Until that time, there was one company which used to do things end to end, right? So one company will design a product and build the entire chip. After in 87, 88, there was someone thought that, you know, this is such a foolish idea. This vertical integration that you have to do, it puts immense amount of upfront costs, right? You have to build a fab cost. Currently, to make a leading edge fab, it will be $12 billion, right? So, I mean, how many companies can do that, right? So, so this idea came up that why don't we do contract manufacturing, right? So regardless of who you are, which company you are, you give us your design and we will just manufacture that final physical product called the chip and give to you, right? And that sort of liberated a lot of companies which just had to design, right? So a new market emerged called fabless, and the manufacturing was contracted out, right? Which was the TSMC and Taiwan, and Morris Chang and all did this in Taiwan. And that's what started a totally new paradigm, right? So fabless companies were liberated from upfront capital costs. The only thing you needed to do is put smart people together, make new designs, focus on intellectual property, and build a new product, right? So that's what they did over time. And then there was more comparative advantage led specialization. So then instead of someone doing the entire manufacturing, someone did just the manufacturing of the die, and then someone else did the packaging, and that was called outsourced assembly and testing. So there was further division of that supply chain, right? So, and that's the result that we have now. So the advantage of this was obviously the costs went down, and there was massive amounts of innovation, right? So there are lots of interesting quotes about it, right? That you know, how in every year you have doubling of performance, right? And if that there's no other industry in which this happens. Absolutely no other industry that you can think of. So that led to a lot of advantages that have happened. But obviously, like everything, there's a flip side to it. The flip side is that the supply chain is not resilient, right? And because you have just one or two companies in each of these nodes of the supply chain who are doing the things that the world wants, right? So, for example, manufacturing equipment, there's only one company which manufactures the lithography machine, which can do leading edge node. So ASML in Netherlands, right? So if you can control that company, or if you can stop that product from going to other companies, you can sort of exert geopolitical influence, right? Similarly, there is, as I said, 55-60% of contract manufacturing of entire world, like especially the leading edge phones, laptops, etc., will be through TSMC, just one company, right? There might be Apple, you might have an Apple phone, you might have any other leading edge phone, but the chip will be finally manufactured at TSMC. So again, if you can control that, or if you can restrict access of that company to others, you can again exert geopolitical influence. That's what US has done by disallowing Chinese companies to sort of manufacture at TSMC, right? And that's a secondary sanction that they have applied. So there's a lot of economics involved in this entire thing, and that's why it's become sort of the big thing. So the way I put it is, it's a metacritical technology. There is a technological imperative because you will need better semiconductors for AI, for 5G, for automotives, etc. There is a geopolitical imperative for the types of things that I said, and there's a geoeconomic imperative, right? Like we talked about how automotive industry the world over is reeling because of the fact that first there was this dip, and then because there is such a supply shortage, when the demand got back, no one wants to manufacture automotive chips because they are low value, right? You would want to manufacture the next chip for the next Apple iPhone instead of doing that. So that's why you have this shortage, and it's not going to be solved for the next 1 or 2 years. So that's where we are.
So from a meta perspective, and Vedat, I'll take your question in just a couple of seconds. From a meta perspective, the one lesson that I have taken from what you spoke about right now, and from quite a few other people as well, is adding a complementary skill has huge but unexpected payoffs at some point of time in the future. But at the stage of an undergraduate, if they are learning economics and if they are asking themselves, well, what complementary skill should I acquire? What framework would you recommend to think about this? In your case, it turned out to be semiconductors, maybe through serendipity, maybe through planning. But what framework should we use to ask ourselves, well, what complementary skill should we go about acquiring?
Right. That's a really important question. So a couple of ideas there. One, I think Naveen spoke in your podcast about this T framework, right? So the way I think of it is a pyramid, right? So the idea is that there will be many, many topics where you at least be a watcher on, right? You're at least able to keep a tab on the things that are happening. A fewer number of things where you will have a framework on, you're able to synthesize and think of, order the things that are actually happening on a daily basis. And a really small 1 or 2 things where you'll be an expert on, right? So think of it as a pyramid. So that's one way to think of it. So the way I would think of it is just try to not specialize very early, so as long as you can keep the base of the pyramid wide and try to experiment, learn different disciplines, it sort of really helps. Okay, so that's one way I think. The other way, other framework that I think is this intersection of domains and disciplines. Right? So oftentimes we think of domain and specializing in this domain, but can you think of arming yourself with the key ideas from many disciplines, right? So if you know the basic logic of what is, say, social psychology, or what is there in psychology, what is there in economics, some key ideas from those disciplines, if you are applying, then think of it as a 2x2, right? There's disciplines and there's domain. So in any domain, you will be able to apply knowledge from these many disciplines when you're thinking about a particular problem. So oftentimes people will think only of the domains, right? So I want to be a health policy analyst, I want to be a health economist, I want to be I don't know, like labor economist, right? But those are the domains. So one, can you think of 2 or 3 domains? And second, think of the disciplines that you want to arm yourself with, so that you can apply them to your health economist domain as well, right? So that's how I would think. And I think I have a book recommendation for that. There is a really good book called Thinker's Guide to Analytical Thinking. It's by Lena Elder and Paul. And I think it is a really nice, it gives a good framework to think of a discipline. So it has an 8-fold path of how do you put a discipline, how do you understand any discipline? So they have this 8 things: purpose, question, information, key concepts, assumptions, inference, implications, and point of view. That's there in the book. But the idea is, if you are able to think of every discipline, right? Think of history. So the questions that you would ask is, what is the purpose of history? Thinking in a way of history. What are the key questions that history asks? What is the information which is key to thinking in for a historian? What are the key concepts that you would want to know? What are the key assumptions that a historian makes, right? What are the inferences that history tries to draw? Similarly, implications and point of view, right? So if you think of this and apply that to any discipline, you will be able to sort of systematically arrange your thoughts while learning a new subject.
Okay, and I'll make a note of the book and I'll add it to my infinitely long to read list.
Yeah.
When I'll get onto it one day. I really hope to speak about RNS and societism. Both are questions that I really want to get a slightly deeper understanding of, but we'll see how we go in terms of time. But before we get to that, a question about your work habits at a daily level and a weekly level. And I'll tell you what I mean when I ask this question. Your newsletter comes out on a Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, anticipating the unanticipated. What is your typical daily routine like in terms of reading habits and chalking out how you plan your day? What do you read and how do you read it? Number one. And number two, at what stage during the week do you start to think of, acha, is hafte mein ye likhna hai for the newsletter? And the reason I ask is for the sake of my students, one, but also for my own sake. How do you go about thinking about mapping out your newsletter on the weekly cadence that you have?
Yeah, so currently the way I write is for the newsletter, I have reserved some time on a Saturday to write about this, right? So I start at whatever 8 p.m. and till I'm able to finish, I'll be awake, right? So that's sort of a commitment that to myself, right? That's so. Before 8 p.m., the thing is you should have already thought of what you want to write on. Otherwise, it's never going to end. So the way I do that is I have a running list of topics. And whenever something comes to my mind, I have a running note where I just keep adding topics in the sections of my newsletter, right? So, and then as you see the news, when you parse some things, some frameworks just fit, right? Like last week, I was thinking of sports and societism because what happened in about sports and India winning a gold medal at the Olympics and things like that. So it's just about parsing the news based on the frameworks that you already have, right? And then certain things connect. You are able to make a link with what you have learned in the past, right? So I guess it's you are able to write once you have accumulated some of those insights, frameworks over a period of time, right? So that helps. So that's one of the ways I do that. So it's basically collecting information through the week and then writing. Then sources of information will be one newspaper. I read generally Business Standard, but otherwise I have a long list of RSS feeds, so just generally Feedbin or any other RSS reader, and just follow those on a topic, right? So I've arranged those things that I want to read, and I go back to them whenever I find time. Books I read only before sleeping, so that's those books put me to bed. So that's how I read books. Otherwise, not through the day. I've not been a person like who reads a lot from a long period of time, So reading is also a habit that I've cultivated over time. Like many people in our field, in our discipline are, they like to read, that they would just read when they are free. I'm not like that. So it's been a habit that I've sort of tried to cultivate. That's one thing. The key thing that I've learned in recent times, and I think it's really something of use to students, and I regret I didn't know this earlier, is taking good notes.
Yeah.
That's a skill that's really important. And taking digital notes, just this idea. So Ashish, do you allow people to have their laptops open in your classes? Like, I mean,
yes.
in pre-COVID times.
Yes, very much.
That I think is so nice, because when I see over the last 6-7 years, I have like so many notebooks where I had written down those notes. They are just useless now, right? I mean, I'm not going to go back to them, and even if I go back to them now, I'll be really searching to make those connections. But over the last 4-5 months, I've started using Obsidian, and you can use any note-taking software, but just taking atomic notes, what a lot of people talk about now, is really liberating. So just whenever you come across something, noting that down, not thinking of making one big note, which is an article, just taking atomic notes is really a superpower, that I didn't know of earlier. So if you folks are interested, just see how to take good notes. If you are able to do that, it's really helpful. That, and when you start to write, that if you are able to make those connections, writing becomes so simple. So because you already have written things on a particular topic over years, over months, and when you start to write, you are not staring at the blank screen with a blank mind. Right? Your mind is already filled with connections, and you just write them out. So that is something that really helps.
Okay. Before we get to another question that I really wanted to ask, before we get to RNS and societism, so you came out with an excellent video, which I would strongly encourage everybody on this talk to watch, about the I forget the exact title, Public Policy: The 8 Things to Unlearn. And the question that I have is actually about the work that some of the students at the Gokhale Institute did in terms of translating it to Marathi. You have an excellent podcast, Pulyabazi. Jeet is a fan, as I'm sure other people on this call are. How do we, as a country, get over this barrier of so many people being so willing to learn but struggling because most of the content available today is in the English language? So I have some thoughts, I'm sure you do as well. But in your case, I'm very curious to hear, A, was that the motivation behind Pulyabazi? And second, how can we make the whole thing slightly more systematic and faster, getting more content generated in local languages?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely that was the motivation, because what we observed is there is a lot of good content in Hindi as well, but the style of it is something which is off-putting, right? It will be in a cliched Hindi, which no one will understand, or it will be done in a boring way, which you wouldn't want to anyways listen on when you're just free and you want to relax, right? So that was the sort of the state of play when we began. So we thought, like, maybe if we are just conversing in a way that people can understand, and we are not also one thing I realized is, just because someone doesn't know English, there is a tendency to infantilize content, right? You will think that isko English nahi aata hai to bewakoof hai. So they'll be like, there are great explainers on YouTube, on Hindi, I'm sure on Marathi also, on everything. But that's not what we wanted to do, right? I mean, just because someone doesn't understand English doesn't mean that you need to just give explanation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So can you talk about the kind of topics that you read in Indian Express opinion columns in Hindi or in any other language was the challenge, right? And that's where we started that. Let's try that. And obviously, like both Saurabh and I, our mother tongue is not Hindi. Not that my mother tongue is Marathi. It's even worse. I don't speak that well, but that was a language we are comfortable with, So we said we'll start with that. We'll speak in a way that just like you and I are conversing. So it's not heavily scripted. It's just an outline that we make upfront, and then we'll start with this. It was mainly a way for us to connect with Hindi and see if we can sort of experiment in another language. And it turns out it was useful for more people, right? So we've continued. And I think I spoke about this earlier on Amit's podcast, but we failed in many experiments before that, right? We tried to form a Quora group on this, where we had, we'll put some terms, English terms, like opportunity cost and transaction cost, convert them into Hindi. So we wrote blog posts on it. We tried to crowdsource what would be a better word for this in a language that an average Hindi reader can understand. So none of those took off, but audio took off somehow. So that's how we've been going about it. What was your thought?
I don't know. So we are currently working with Alex and Tyler for translating some of the Marginal Revolution University videos into Marathi to begin with, and then see if we can expand it to other languages. But it's frightfully difficult to do. So progress has been very, very slow. And most of the stuff that I've seen on YouTube, I agree with you. I don't know why the assumption is that just because you don't know the English language, you somehow don't have the ability to think at a complex level at all, which is infuriating and frustrating. But it's something that I want to work on this year and try and generate, or at least help generate more content or replicate more content in other languages. It's something that I think we need to do as quickly as possible.
If I had to add to that, Ashish, one thing I learned is maybe like replication doesn't work for me many times. You know, when you're thinking of just converting in English as it is to Hindi or Marathi, there's a lot of transmission loss in that. So for example, if you are able to think of the main concept remains the same, but the examples have to be really different.
Recontextualized.
The muhavras that you use in Hindi will be different. You know, so if you are able to think of those, then it sort of I feel it connects better. You know, so it shouldn't be just translation or it should be like thinking ground up. You know,
localized examples.
To someone using authentic examples, using things which people connect with, that is obviously more challenging for me as well, but that's where you get more bang for the buck, is what I feel.
Interesting. So it'll add to the time, but I completely agree with you when you say that localized examples will make it even better. Yes, I.
Yeah, no, so I just had one thing. So since we were talking about certain terminologies, would you be a fan of translating, like finding alternate words for certain economic concepts in another language? Or is it better that people catch on to the common English parlance for certain words so that eventually they have access to a larger content, which is ultimately in English? Because that's something I always find very difficult. So let's say an opportunity cost, fair enough, maybe. But when you start talking about maybe econometric terms or things like that, I mean, we'll really need to create words, because I'm sure there isn't a word for heteroscedasticity. I mean, why would there be one? So then, you know, so what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think it runs both ways. Like, see, the ideal way, even I agree. I mean, there's nothing like sacrosanct about you know, a language and preserving that and all that. I'm not at all for that. You know, in fact, I'm an anti-purist, right? So if an English word makes sense, you just use it, right? Why would you do that? The other side to that is just thinking of why is it that people are not using those other terms, right? Because sometimes the translated word is so complex, or it uses a terminology that people don't speak in common parlance, that it just dies away, right? It's only in the textbooks that you read. So the idea was, if we can simplify it, maybe, you know, there will be a value in value generated just because people are able to connect with that term much better, you know. So that was the idea. And the second idea is also that, you know, the fact that eventually there is some knowledge resident in all our languages, right? And if we are not able to think of these terms, using those languages absolutely will make no sense, right? Eventually all of us would start using the terms which are used in English. But now I learned Mandarin. Okay, so I've learned like level 4 Mandarin, and in Mandarin there is a term for everything. You know, you don't never have to use an English word. They even have translations for names of Trump and names of leaders, right? So everything has you never use an English word. And those translations are really simple, you know, like they are intuitive. They are not really complex words. They are joining two simple things to form a complex word kind of a thing, you know. So there's some value, I think, in being able to do that. So I think, yeah, I would definitely not say, yeah, use our language because there's something great in our languages, and then that's why I don't use English. But I feel there is some value if we are able to explain concepts in simpler words of our own languages. That's instead of using a word that people will not have been familiar with. That's where I would put it.
Right, makes sense.
I have one last question to ask before I turn it over to the students, but I can't resist asking a question related to what you spoke about. What is the word for Trump in Mandarin? If you're saying it's simple translations, I'm very curious to know now.
Yeah. No, so for Trump, there is a really complex one, just Chuanpu, and there is a big history. There is a government-approved translation in Mandarin. So every leader will have a government. But I'll give you an example of a simple translation, right? Like a train is called Huocha. Like it just means a fire vehicle. That's all. Fire vehicle is train. So there are many such terms which are quite intuitive once you read that. So that's why I think it's important if we are able to translate in an intuitive way in our languages. I think there's some value generated out of it.
Okay, one last very easy question before we turn it over to the students. Societism. So the way I understand it, it really is, and I'll use the example of sports from your latest newsletter, a greater role for society along with market and state in whichever sphere of life we happen to be discussing about. There's more to it than that, but I suppose it's a functional definition or a functional way to think about what societism means. And if that is correct, how do we get a better, more important role for societism in the field of education? And when I say education, I mean learning. I don't mean certification. How do we get society more interested in the act of learning itself? And number two, how does society get involved in providing better learning as different from better certificates?
Yeah, deep question. So, the idea behind societism, as you pointed out, is just that there are complementary strengths for each of these actors, right? And generally, the tendency is to think in a dichotomy, right? State versus market. But there are things that societies can do, and I'm sure students must be learning Elinor Ostrom's work and how even sometimes society can help provide substitutes when markets and governments both fail, right? And there is a third way. So from that, if we start off from that lens, even for education, right? If you look at it, education, if it is in the hands of governments or it is for certification, it will only be attuned towards finally what you get out of it. So it will be towards jobs. You will probably prioritize things which get you better jobs, right? That would be the aim of structured education in our colleges and universities. So I always think of what are the complementarities, right? Don't substitute, but what are the things that you can complement, right? So so the way I think of it is societies, for example, a lot of philanthropy would go into education of teaching basic education to people, right? Now, I think that is a role of either the state or the markets can do it. I think society doesn't have any special advantage in it. But if you can complement it, right? For example, then arts education or how say museums should be maintained or such things. It's very tough for me to imagine that you will have a government university or a market-based solution which will do this really well. So can society pitch in there? So I think there are lots of many things which even telling people how we can write better, how we can communicate better. I think there is a lot of things that society can do there. How we can mobilize people together. These are things where society has a comparative advantage because a lot of social reform or a lot of mobilization eventually happens out of society itself, right? So if we are able to teach this thing in education, I think we'll be complementing the knowledge that we gain through structured means.
Fantastic. Pranay, thank you so much. I think we're going to go a little bit over time, and if you're okay with that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as long as it's not boring for others, we can go.
We have a captive audience. Don't worry about them. So
Okay.
I'll begin by asking the questions that have come up in the chat window. And if there are more, either raise your hands or keep putting them in the chat window. Vedant asks, when does the Wassenaar arrangement come into the picture as far as the export restrictions of semiconductor technologies are concerned?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, right? So the fact is, in a lot of this in international relations is that power is really the currency, right? So the way US did, for example, is it could just impose a secondary sanction on TSMC because TSMC uses equipments which are manufactured by US companies, you know, and then restricted. And I mean, who opposed that? There's if you have power, you can control a lot of these things. I mean, the way we say is in international relations, it is Matsya Nyaya, right? It is the law of the fishes. The bigger fish eats the smaller fish. So a lot of these technology transfer arrangements and all are actually a mirror image of that power equations. So in semiconductors also there are so many export restrictions already put in place because it has always been thought of as this strategic industry. So you can easily go like violate some of these things, and there are enough exceptions for you if you can get away with them. You know, and some certain countries can, and they do.
Okay, Jeet has two questions. I'll save you the trouble for the second one. Jeet asks, as you say, overpopulation is not a problem under governances. What is its context or how can it be justified? Jeet, I would recommend taking a Kindle Unlimited subscription and reading Shruti's chapter from the book that Pranay co-edited. That entire chapter is about why overpopulation is not a problem. That being said, Pranay, if you have anything to add to what Shruti has said in the chapter, please.
Yeah, actually, this quote is by Nitin, and I really like that, right? Like overpopulation. And the way I was thinking about is like, if you read our books from the 50s and 60s, a lot of it is about the biggest problem in India is population, right? And even Ambedkar wrote about it in the manifesto of the Scheduled Caste Federation, right? And that talks, he says two main problems: population and the fact that our agriculture is unremunerative. We have to mechanize and all that. So population was thought of as a big problem by many stalwarts back then. Now I'm thinking of it now in 2021. How do we think of population and the idea is, I mean, population is there, so it's there, right? I mean, you just face it and use it. I mean, thinking of saying that because population is a problem, that's how our causal link starts, right? In a causal in casual conversations, people will always say India doesn't do XYZ because we are a big country, we have so many problems, so many different views and all that, right? And that's like saying that what the people itself are a problem, right? You're saying that we are ourselves a problem. Then if we start from that proposition, then the only solution is that, yeah, I mean, what can we do? We should be less number of people. How do we do that? You know, and I also think from the population problem, maybe it was in reality a problem in 50s, but it has solved by itself over time, right? Like the fertility rates across regions, across religions are dropping. We'll already at 2.6, 2.2, I think, and we'll already reach the replacement level soon. So it's a problem that is solving by itself. So why would you then focus on it? Once you focus on it, the locus of the solution really then shifts to giving a free pass for the government, right? So yeah, I mean, there are too many people in Bangalore. What is the solution to that? Then you will never think of people and government providing better facilities to people. You will only think of get people out of them because there is some mythical capacity of a city. And you are already exceeded that. Who decided that capacity? There's no such capacity. In migration to many cities like New York and all, the rates had been much faster than they have been to Pune or Bangalore, right? So we can manage that. And you always have a counter example in China as well, right? You had the fact that you had a large population which actually was the reason why a lot of FDI flowed there, right? So why would you think of population as a problem? It's like saying we are a problem. We are really not. We should hold our governments to better account. We are so many, so yeah, solve for us. That's why you take so much taxes from us, you take so many resources from us, right? And that's the way I would think.
Yeah. And both Iran and China are excellent examples of how to not do planned population planning. The repercussions decades on the line are scary.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great book on this as well. One Child, Mei Fong's book on China as well, and it really is a very good articulation of how increase in population was a boon for China in many ways, and in fact their one-child policy was counterproductive in so many ways.
Okay, another question by Jeet. I'm sorry, I don't know the context. Maybe Jeet can add it if needed. He's asking about the thoughts about the significance of the distinction between price and value in public policy.
Yeah. No, I mean, you guys know about this better, right? Just differentiating between cost, price, value, right? That is so useful, right? Because sometimes people will think, oh, if something is valuable, then it should be sort of, how can it have a higher price? No, it should actually be lower price because it is valuable to everyone. So it's just disambiguating these three concepts is quite useful even in public policy, right? So yeah, I mean, the classic example that you all must be learning, diamond and water, and why is one costly, why isn't that? All those are also important ideas even in public policy, right? An example I can give you is, we were thinking of this Kaveri water, right? There is a lot of contestation on it between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu always, right? So how do we sort of think of solving this problem, right? And a lot of times, a lot of tribunals solutions have been given, Supreme Court verdicts have been given, but the problem remains unresolved, right? So one way we were thinking of is just like how it is done in Australia as well. But the idea is, can you sort of figure out a solution to put an economic value to the water, and then can you figure out ways to exchange, if one particular state overuses from its capacity, can it sort of compensate the other state in this regard? And then, so you enable transactions to happen beyond the water itself, so that states can probably figure out other solutions, build better water storage systems, etc. Right, so dissociating price of that water from the value is really useful in public.
All right. For the comments, I think Murli weighs in on Saili's side of the argument. At least that's how I understand it, saying that always a literal translation may not be a good idea. So, for example, a telescope should be called a telescope rather than a doorbin, or nuclear makes more sense than Parmanu. But I think it's a spectrum, right? So a literal translation, I don't think makes sense. In some cases, perhaps it makes sense to just go with the English language. But where to draw the balance, there'll always be a different opinion.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, doorbin would be binoculars, but how would, my idea is just to think of, if we can think of better ways to communicate these words, I'm sure we'll be able to come up with better translation. Not literal translations. I don't mean literal translations always. I mean better translations. Translations which use terminology that we often use in our day-to-day language. Right? That's the area.
I feel the issue with local languages is also that every 200 to 250 odd kilometers, the style and the vocabulary also changes. So that sort of also poses like another challenge, right? So even if you just take Hindi, and if you compare central UP, Bihar versus Mumbai, everyone speaks Hindi, but the vocabulary itself is so different that then again that becomes an additional challenge of, you can find words, but then which part of the country are you resonating with? I mean, whose Hindi are you trying to?
Yeah.
No, Madhya Pradesh has another whole different way of Hindi. So
Hindi it is easier because it's Bollywood. It's the Hindi that we use is Bollywood.
That
we
Hindi.
speak Hindustani, right? It's Hindi, Urdu, a lot of mix. So that if you are able to communicate in that, then everyone understands. Everyone has heard songs, Pyar, Aatbar, Intezar, all these songs, 90s songs, right? So
But so koi fark nahi padta curve is a very memorable way to think of indifference curves, for example, rather than whatever the technical definition of translation of indifference is. All right, two more questions.
Thinking like opportunity cost, kuch paane ke liye kuch khona padta hai. That's opportunity cost, right? If you are you always know kuch paane ke liye kuch khona. That's opportunity cost. If you are able to think of such, say, muhavre, such statements, idioms in your own languages, I think we can form a nice vocabulary.
I actually call it the Bazigar moment. So I'm glad to see that you share the exact same example. When I teach opportunity cost, I call it the Bazigar moment.
We should start working on a parallel dictionary.
Yeah.
The Bollywoodization of economics.
Yeah.
So it'll be a fun exercise.
Actually.
And actually, Pranay, if you're on board, then we can make that happen.
Yeah.
Fun way to...
Game.
Okay, two last questions if you have the time, Pranay. Both are from Vedant. One is, where do you think India stands and has the potential to stand in the global semiconductor supply chain, given that an attempt to make a fabrication plant has failed to materialize? I myself am very pessimistic about it, but I'm glad to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, the way I think of it is, think of it as a value chain, right? Don't think of, there's too much fascination with, right, this isomorphic mimicry, right? Because US has 5 nanometer fab, why should we have? There's no need. It's okay if we don't have, so the way I think of it is, first of all, in that value chain, you have to think of where is the maximum value captured from an economic sense, right? And most 60% of the value is in the design, right? It's not in manufacturing. Manufacturing is actually high capital intensive. You don't make much margins per chip, and the returns only come if you are able to put in money after every few years. So there is recurring cost, there is huge upfront cost. So think of it in another way, right? Can we have more design units? Our focus should be, can more intellectual property come out of intellectual property design come out of India? Simple. That is something which we can target. We already have the expertise. We have the comparative advantage because of the FDI that has streamed in since 1985. There are companies, there are people who know the entire manufacturing cycle. There are experts who have worked there for 30-35 years, right? So we can tap onto that. That's our strength. Let's build on that. Second, when we think of manufacturing, I would say there's still a lot of advantage to be had in the trailing edge nodes, 65 nanometer, 100 nanometer, 110 nanometer. Let's manufacture that. I think if we are able to solve that, most of our strategic angle can be done at that level. For getting the strategic angle sorted, you don't need to make 5 nanometer chips. Those are just used for we say laptops, phones, others things that you're using now. But if you are able to do good things at 45 nanometer, eventually or 28 nanometer, you can solve your defense problems, you can solve your space related issues easily. Third angle of this is, it doesn't mean if there is no fab in India, we have a problem. Our idea is, if you have the supply chain with enough resilience, your problem is sorted, which you can do if you form good partnerships with other countries. So that's why the paper I had written is, can you use Quad as a mechanism, for example, to ensure that within your 4 countries, you at least have access to the things, manufacturing facilities that you want. As long as you do that, it's fine, right? I find this idea of technological self-sufficiency very dangerous, because there's no supply chain now which you can completely indigenize. Probably you could do that in 1950s, right? Yeah. There's none of the technology supply chains are that way now. Whether you think of AI research, etc., none of them are that way. So why fight that losing battle?
All right. And the last question for the day, Vedant had one more, but it's so complicated that I'll take a pass on it for the moment, but I'll mail this to you separately, Pranay, if you're okay with it. Anchi had a question which is a fascinating one. You said earlier in the talk that there isn't a lot of time when you formulate solutions in terms of a request from the government. Under such circumstances, which aspects of the policy should you be optimizing for? The second half of the question, Anchi, I think you should read In the Service of the Republic. But the first half of the question is a fascinating one.
Yeah. The way I would think of it is, what are the criteria of any policy, right? So you would have some common criteria, right? Effectiveness, efficiency, equity, full feasibility, right? These, I think, would be there in every policy. And all the solutions that you think will vary on these 4 parameters, right? So maybe you will have some which are more equitous but less effective and less even less efficient. So equity, efficiency, effectiveness, feasibility, these are the 4 that I think of. I would, if the government is asking for I would probably focus on effectiveness first, right? Does the solution that you are saying actually solve the problem that was posed to you? That's what effectiveness is, right? So that probably you would prioritize compared to the others. But obviously, you would not want to have the second highest priority I would give is to equity consideration, right? Government is not a corporation, so you can't think of solutions which are inequitous. So the idea is that would again be the second important consideration, and so on and so forth, right? That's the way I would think of if you really have to choose. And I know I'm like hugely simplifying this. The reality is much more complex, but as I said, public policy is about confronting trade-offs, and you will confront these trade-offs. There will be no perfectly equitous solution which will solve your problem effectively using the least resources.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you have to make that trade-off.
Yeah. Great, Pranay. Where can people reach out so long as you're willing with their questions, requests for help?
Sure. I mean, I can send you you have my email ID. So
yeah. Done. Okay, I'll share it with everybody.
Yeah.
I haven't covered half my questions. The students had a lot more. So maybe, Pranay, if you're willing, we can do this at the start of the next semester as well. We'll have you as a returning guest.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, even I had more things to say, especially about your framework on that LinkedIn, Starbucks, Coursera thing. Maybe we talk about
oh, I mean, if you want to, please go ahead.
No. I mean, the thought that I had was, there's one more angle to it, college. 2 thoughts I have. One, there's LinkedIn, there's Starbucks, there's Coursera, and then college is sometimes also a proto Tinder, so to say. Because I mean, I literally, my wife and I were classmates in college. So there's so there's a, how can you forget that? There is a bigger, I mean, the idea is that you make relationships in colleges, right? It's just not networking. Relationships which are also important. Then another related thought that I had is what you said about LinkedIn, Starbucks, Coursera in a broader sense is about the need to sort of signal, the need to sort of connect with others, form a community. And the third one is need to learn, right? So these are 3. If you think very broadly at a meta level, this framework can be applied to many other things. Like, why are you on Twitter, for example? Twitter also can give all these 3 things to you, right? So you're on Twitter sometimes to signal, to form a network, and to learn, right? All 3 things. So any social network you would be a part of are probably a mix of these things. So that framework probably can be applied at a meta level to many other things.
Absolutely. Right? It just can't be unbundled as easily in college. It's possible to unbundle it on Twitter, but I don't think you can unbundle college as easily as you can unbundle Twitter.
Yeah.
And if I could go back in time, the only reason I chose Starbucks is because I wanted to make the example relevant to anybody who was reading it. But I would be horrified at the thought that students network at Starbucks rather than the local college tapri.
Yeah. That's good. We don't have much time. I just make one more point, sort of from what I would do things differently. Couple of points. Don't want to go in great detail given the paucity of time. But one thing I realize is just that college is not school, just because it comes for after that. There's a difference, right? In school, teacher tells you to do everything. You have a path, you just follow. And one thing that I really would change going back is just thinking of college being very different from school, which means you can go to your prof and say, I want to do a project, give me something to work on. It's not just that the prof has to tell you to do a certain
Thank you.
That is something that I really regret not doing in college, right? Just going more to profs. I just did that on one occasion, but I would have wanted to go back and say, no, give me a project. I want to work on this, interests me. So I would request students to do that, given that you have such fantastic profs at your institution. So second thing, again, is removing this disgust for politics. Again, there is politics just doesn't mean electoral politics, but just politics starts with when 2 or 3 people meet, right? There's politics going on even here. So that idea, I used to have that disgust for politics, but if you can overcome that and get involved in whatever mobilization in whatever limited way, right? Like, I mean, if there is shortage in your block for water, if you can just ask people to get the water into your blocks in the pre-COVID times, would have been a useful thing to learn. That's one thing. And I think other things your podcast has covered already well about importance of stories, narratives, speaking well, really important. As long as we can't tell better stories, we can't make change happen.
Indeed.
Finally, about collaboration, anything is a team sport, and public policy is definitely a team sport. So I would say that as long as you can collaborate with others, it's a skill you will, which will hold you in good stead for your life. So collaborate, do things with more people. If you are doing anything with n people, just think of increasing it to n+1. I think that's a good start.
I would add a little bit to it. Learning how to collaborate with people you don't necessarily get along well with is a skill that really more people should learn. And that includes us uncles as well, I suppose.
True. And one thing that really helped me was sometimes just picking up one activity, one that you're good at. It can sort of feed into your studies or feed into other things that you are. So I mean, just to give a personal example, in the first semester I was really obsessed about doing well in studies, because I came from Goa. My sort of all India rank was way low in my college, right? So there was this inferiority complex that I'm like so behind all these people who are toppers from their state. So how will I manage? So I started obsessively getting involved in studies, and that had absolutely no desirable outcomes. I didn't get any better marks than I would have desired. So one thing that I learned is from the next semester onwards, I started investing more time in an activity that I love. I used to like cricket, so played for the college cricket team and all that. And that sort of really helped me, that the positivity that came from the cricket field rubbed onto studies as well. So you become more effective at the challenging thing that you're doing by picking up any other activity that you really love. So I would suggest, if there are opportunities, pick up a thing that you love, diversify, that helps you do the thing that is challenging better. So that's where I would just stop.
Fantastic. Pranay, thank you so much for making the time. And I really do hope you agree to come back in January. All of us have a whole host of questions.
Thank you. Thanks all. I hope there was some signal and no noise. Not all noise.
Bye.